Have you ever felt scared of your own body? Maybe there's a certain part that you don't like being touched, or perhaps this generalized feeling of never getting comfortable in your own skin. You know that something isn't quite right, but you haven't got the exact words to make sense of the internal experience, and it's something which is surprisingly normal. I've discovered over the years, through my own story of physical anxiety and bodily dissociation, that I was not a unique case. I generally lived behind or even above my eyes, and I didn't enjoy the feeling of being an earthy, fleshy human. I never settled into my skeleton, and many people have this lifestyle where they never do that either. There's this general fear of the flesh, a general flight from our own physical reality. So today we're going to be discussing this question about the fear of embodiment and some ways that we can gently ease into movement practices without becoming overwhelmed, because it's such a difficult conversation to have in a generalized sense. I do have 3 books to recommend over here and 1 extra book over here. We are going to be very much looking into body-centered psychotherapy approaches towards holistic self-healing and actually resolving this feeling of anxiety, but we need to frame the conversation. I've got 2 quotes I'm going to read, but before we dive into the books, I wanted to be abundantly clear that the physical reality that we are blessed to experience is not something to avoid. We age, we get sick, we suffer injuries, and the body can often be a place where we feel like it's mind versus flesh, or that our identity exists up here and doesn't extend down here, or maybe an overblown charge towards our identity being defined by gender, race, or sexual orientation. All of these different ideas around identity which have anchors and envoys within this physical fleshy experience. It's a tricky topic to go into. I hope that the outcome from today's video will give you a few books to go into for your own study, and hopefully that feeling of being able to come back to your body. And if you've got any strange particularities of hating your own heartbeat, or not liking your feet being touched, or generally feeling like there's a concrete barrier that cuts you off at the head, or maybe a heavy congealed feeling in your heart, or maybe constantly cold or very sweaty hands, you can start to understand why these patterns are appearing in your life. So let's go into the books. I already held up Body-Centered Psychotherapy, the Hakomi Method. I think this is by Ron Kurtz. It is by Ron Kurtz. Fantastic. We're not going to be going into this in this video in too much detail, and neither are we going to be going into The Body Bears the Burden by Robert Scare, but I'm holding these up just so you can pause the video, screenshot the video, and get these in your own time. They are 2 very practical body-based psychotherapy books. But I have 2 different books to go into to frame today's conversation and give us some real practical guidance to gently ease into embodiment. But we first need to understand just how deep the issue is. Because if you don't understand how much of a problem it is, which many of us don't because we were born into dissociative spaces, we were trained as little children to sit at the little plastic tables in those little plastic chairs, and if we wanted to raise our hand to go to the toilet and it had only been half an hour since we last went to the toilet, we probably had the teacher say, no, little Jordan, you need to hold that in because it's 2 hours until lunchtime and you better not miss this very important lesson about arithmetic. Literally heavily conditioned from all of that schooling experience of sitting down those tiny cramped tables and getting maybe half an hour to an hour of outdoor time, and having scheduled sports classes for a couple hours per week. And then if you're someone like me, you were raised on television and video games and indoor activities, and it's just so heavily conditioned into us that we often don't realize how significantly problematic it is to be disconnected from such an important source of identity, and then to get focused again on things like race and gender and orientation, rather than taking that opportunity to look at ourselves from the inside out and realizing that the connection between the heart, the gut, the sensual areas of our body as well, and our mind, all tied together, and then wrapping it in something like a spiritual perspective and seeing our soulful essence is what we need to be healthy. truly healthy. But that's enough of my rant. Let's go into some of the quotes from the book. First book that I'm going to be reading from is The Betrayal of the Body by Alexander Lowen, my favorite bioenergetic therapist. I've held this book up at least 20 times on this channel. Fantastic quote to frame the problem today. Highly recommend that you get this book for yourself. So, this is a quote talking about, well, Alexander Lowen has a variety of character structures. He calls this character the schizoid, and it's an extract about the schizoid archetype. We don't need to go into it for the sake of this video. This represents the person who is afraid of being embodied and has a generally dissociative, overly heady experience of reality. As I read this quote, if this sounds like you, an extra moment, a couple minutes into this video to just realize how important it is you do resolve this issue. Quote from the book, what does it feel like to be disembodied on a chronic, perpetual, and problematic scale? Suspended between reality and illusion, infancy and maturity, life and death. He rejects his past but feels unsure of the future. He has no present, no ground under his feet. If you're a woman, of course, just change it out. I'm just reading what's from the book. Feeling dangers within and fearing dangers without. Crucial phrase. Feeling dangers within and fearing dangers without. We'll return to that one. He is mobilized in fright or mobilized for flight. In both conditions, he is never far from a feeling of panic and never sure which button can set it off. A little bit further down on the page. How do we heal this? If one can breathe easily, the underlying feeling of panic disappears. Similarly, the physiological responses, which are determined by an unconscious sense of despair, change when an individual can face his despair. There's a few ideas that come up there. There's the idea of fear, there's the idea of hopelessness, and of course, the gift that we all have access to, a good deep breath. Of course, that wasn't the deepest breath that I could possibly do, but you get the point. Let's jump from this book straight to another book, and then we're going to weave the two ideas together and come back into this concept of feeling dangers within and fearing dangers without, because we need a double-spaced approach towards this physical healing question. You need to have a bodily story, but you also need to have an existential story, which is why we're turning towards Ernest Becker and the classic book that you might have read, The Denial of Death. This is a philosophical exploration of man's essential question, which is, why are we born and why do we die? And if you don't have some degree of philosophical resolution to that question, if you haven't worked on the question of the meaning of your life and the existential anxiety of being a human, you won't fully accept your humanness. Your mortality will be something that you keep at an arm's length or locked away in a private cupboard of your mind. You really need to consider this, because somatic therapy itself will only get you so far. If you start to go deep into breath work and you start to do somatic-based approaches towards trauma healing and all the things I talk about in this channel, but you don't have a greater overarching sense of meaning, a wide sphere of purpose to place yourself into as a human being with an earthy, fleshy existence, a new form of anxiety will take over, and you're quite vulnerable to going back into that same dissociative trend. We'll go more into this in the second half of the video. Let's bring out a quote from Ernest Becker and his incredibly well-written book. I highly recommend you get this one if you're tackling this question of physical embodiment, and also maybe some general what is the purpose of life and where do I fit into the cosmic order. Great book to read. So, quote from the book about man's essential problem, and it's very on topic for today's video. Man's body is a problem to him that has to be explained. And again, it's speaking towards men, it's just the style of the writing at the time. I'm just going to read from the book. We can change as is relevant. Man's body is a problem to him that has to be explained. Not only his body is strange, but also its inner landscape, the memories and the dreams. Man's very insides, his self, are foreign to him. He doesn't know who he is, why he was born, what he is doing on the planet, and what he is supposed to do and what he can expect. His own existence is incomprehensible to him, a miracle, just like the rest of creation, closer to him, right near his pounding heart. But for that reason, all the more strange, wonderful language. Each thing is a problem, and man can shut out nothing. As Maslow has well said, quote, "It is precisely the godlike in ourselves that we are ambivalent about, fascinated by and fearful of, motivated to and defensive against." Quoting Abraham Maslow there. If you want to read a bit of Maslow, you can go for a book like The Farther Reaches of Human Nature. Hopefully that comes up. Or you can read a book like this one, Toward a Psychology of Being by Abraham Maslow. And those are two great humanistic self-therapy books. Just spontaneous moment. Read some Abraham Maslow, you'll love it. Let's finish off the quote. "This is one aspect of the basic human predicament." Final sentence, that we are simultaneously worms and gods. There it is again. Gods with anuses. We are divine creatures who are born to poop, and if we do not accept the dual nature of our divinity and our poopy nature, then we are going to be forever fearful of the bodily reactions and also the mortality that we are inevitably going to experience. I really wanted to take the time to bring out a quote like that, because you can't resolve the question of gently easing into an embodiment practice if you're not willing to embrace the vulnerability and the fragility of this experience. When I was a teenager, I was overweight for a period of time. I was clinically obese in terms of going over a BMI ratio. When I was about 15, 16, I was a fat teenage boy because I'd never properly settled into my body, because it wasn't a place that I wanted to exist. I didn't have enough positive physical experiences in my childhood, and my family environment, it was the way it was. It wasn't a place that I felt safe for a variety of reasons I don't need to go into. So naturally, I did the classic pattern, which is you can either shrink all the way in, which is where we get things like anorexia and bulimia, and that's shrinking away from the world, disappearing into skeleton, or you can pad yourself with extra body armor, metaphorically speaking, and you can disappear from the space, or maybe you find comfort in food. I went towards the padding out, and also I was physically inactive, so maybe it wasn't that deep, but nonetheless, I was literally fatter than I needed to be. But the crucial element that I want to go into isn't about that aspect of being overweight. It's about my overall attitude towards my body at the time. This is an incredibly vulnerable thing to share on a video. It's something I don't experience now. It's coming through as a moment that feels relevant. There were so many small things during that period of being out of touch with physical vitality, being overweight and not training, having no real life outside of screens and school and video games and all kinds of issues with substances and adult material on the internet. I had certain interesting fears around bathroom time. I didn't like going to the toilet because I felt like this excessive disgust response. It wasn't something that overwhelmed me, but I remember at certain times, when it comes to the moment where you've got to go in there and clean yourself off, I'd have this real disgust response. It didn't help that my mother had irritable bowel syndrome, and a lot of conversations were around the ins and outs of information I just didn't need to know about. But my body literally didn't feel like a place that I wanted to accept. I didn't like the fact that I was sweaty. I didn't like the fact that I had to go to the toilet. I suffered from allergies in the spring and the summer. And also when I'd have the moments, this is incredibly vulnerable, men can relate to this, that moment when you're a man and you get towards the release of the private experience where it's you and your hand, and there's a simultaneous release, and then a bit of a disgust response at how messy everything is. That's a really common experience for the majority of men that I've spoken with if we ever go to that conversation, and women have their own equivalent when it comes to their menstrual cycle, or even when it comes to any kinds of fluids that might be coming out of their body. We're so gunky and fleshy, and all of these various secretions and smells are so fundamentally human. Very few of us accept that. Very few of us have this feeling of being welcomed into a bodily reality by the family and the society, which sees the normality of the human mess. Teenage girls have so much shame about menstrual cycles. Teenage boys get so much shame about their sweat or about their own, secretions, let's say. And we tend to carry this on into our adult lives, and then there's a simultaneous, if you want to go deep into the psychology, we will come back to it being practical, there's a simultaneous pedestalization and a disgust response. And you've got all kinds of strange things that happen when people romanticize and push away at the same time. What I mean by this is that you can simultaneously have a love-hate response to various processes in your own body. Women can start to have a feeling, for example, of being incredibly empowered by their menstrual cycle when they learn to work with the 4 stages of their bleed, and they learn how to schedule their life around certain energetic changes, certain hormonal changes, and they generally feel like a fully embodied woman. They learn the power of their menstruation, and they use that to get whatever experience they particularly want as a particular individual. But then it goes to a deeper level where sometimes they'll then notice extra layers of shame or extra layers of vulnerability and hesitation around ovulation or menstruation itself. Maybe there's too much energy coming up in ovulation and they feel like they're getting a bit manic. Or maybe they start to get so contracted during their bleed that they become so antisocial that they don't even recognize their identity anymore. The bodily-based identity that they are anchored into as a healthy woman nonetheless has these feelings of vulnerability, because if you really want to accept that we are both gods and worms, the worm-like nature of our beautiful body does mean that we'll have moments where we are truly quite afraid about things which are outside of our control. Not everything can be controlled. There are certain bodily responses that are truly subconscious and automatic. And if we don't accept that there's a degree of uncertainty in our bodily experience, we can have systems in place to be able to deal with this. For example, let's say that someone has a particularly strong reaction to their menstrual cycle. They can develop a whole therapeutic psychological approach towards the fact that for a few days per month they have a certain identity shift in one way or another due to certain hormonal reactions inside of them. They don't need to get to a point of 100% acceptance of that ultimately unwanted experience. If we're just going to be honest, very few women want to have the experience of having a significant change in their body, in their temperament, and feeling like they have to arrange work and arrange social lives in a way which navigates everything. There's almost this idea that you're losing something there, and then you can go deeper into the menstrual, wisdom of the menstrual cycle. Not going to make a video completely on the menstrual cycle. The point I'm trying to stumble all around is that there are mixed parts inside of us which simultaneously praise and devalue certain bodily processes. Let's shift the conversation towards aging as an ultimate thread before making this really practical. You're an adult watching this video. You were a child and you will continue to get older, and at a certain point you will no longer be here. You'll be dead. Your body will decay, and hopefully you've got life into your 80s and your 90s, and maybe even beyond there. You'll stay mobile, you'll stay active, you're already not drinking, you're already not smoking, you're already removing toxins from your life. You've got many more decades of beautiful experience ahead. But there's still a genuine fear in my heart, and maybe in your heart as well, that as we age, there might be a certain day where we can no longer stand up without the support of a walking stick, or maybe we can no longer run easily, or maybe a certain disease takes control and it feels like it's outside of our control. No matter how healthily we live, and no matter how much energy magic you might want to do about positive affirmations, and something like cancer can't appear if you have a healthy internal state, I don't think it's fully true. I think there's elements of truth in those ways of approaching the mind-body connection and having this integrated approach towards holistic identity, but there are things which are outside of our control. Aging is inevitable. Feelings of embarrassment around a bowel movement which is suddenly much firmer or much looser than you intended or even expected, or a feeling of getting food sick, for example, and needing to relieve yourself of that poison inside of you, and your bodily automatic reaction is, get rid of this, out of my body, it's purged. I still don't like throwing up. I just don't like it. I don't think anyone really likes throwing up, but I notice that even at this stage, having worked through my real bad period in time, age 20 or so, I remember I got sick when I was on a trip, and I had so much anxiety about needing to keep that in because I didn't want the experience of releasing that. And of course, it ties into deeper traumas from childhood of not getting the best reactions when I was sick. There was punishment for being ill. There was punishment for being sick. It wasn't a great experience. And there's a variety of these deeply embedded memories tied in with bodily memories. Again, returning to the menstrual cycle example of being shamed maybe as a 14-year-old girl or maybe being a 15-year-old boy, where you show up, you literally had a shower that morning. You go to school and 2 hours later, you smell dreadful because you're a teenager full of hormones, and now you have this strange response where you really want to make sure that you have no possible sweat smell at all, and you cover yourself in cologne, and you're washing 2 or 3 times per day. It's a bit exaggerated, but there are many different people who are going to be interested in topics like this, and they've all got their unique fixations and hesitations and a variety of anxieties about their body, because every body is different, even if we share generalized trends. The traumas and the wounding that we've suffered will never be completely resolved. You just won't resolve it. There will always be a feeling of tension, that the body will always be a little bit awkward and a little bit of something which is outside of your control if you truly go deep enough with the narrative. At the initial stages, that feeling of integration between mind, heart, and guts, and the feeling of I am here, as Jordan, as one solid, wonderfully fluid, yet simultaneously fixed and rigid and static and also ever-changing entity. If you go deep enough into the philosophical understanding of identity and somatic reality, everything is so permanently in flux and so much outside of your awareness, in the same way that we have subpersonalities and different parts inside of us, that we can never be fully in control and we will never be fully embodied as the theory of embodiment would have us, go into. We will have this trend of dissociating up into our head. When you're watching a video like this on the screen, you've probably lost a bit of awareness in your body. Probably haven't breathed very deeply in the last few minutes. Maybe you are physically active right now, but still, can bring in more awareness, can sink down. There's always more to be experienced, and part of the process that I believe is quite exciting is if you're afraid of easing into a physical movement practice, you can just start with each symptom layered and layered and layered. You can notice that you have a tight and constricted throat. You can notice that you have certain disgust responses towards bowel movements, or for me, for example, that's certain disgust response towards throwing up. And you can be curious as you explore that particular pattern of energetic story. There's something in the body, there's something in the mind. You don't need to fix it all at once. You don't need to heal everything all at once. It's just such an overwhelming idea, which is why perhaps today's questioner has this feeling of, what do I do if I know I'm already dissociative, or maybe my body isn't a place that I want to exist? How do I come back into the body? You do it step by step. You build up the time spent in your body in a loving way. If you're in a safe, secure, romantic relationship, you can have these conversations with your partner, and they can use their touch, they can use their presence, they can use their love to support you in that process. But you don't need someone else. You've got your own touch. You've got your own presence. You've got your own ability to love your flesh from the inside out. Healthy behaviors don't poison this temple. And give yourself that feeling of reverence. Go to the gym, get into a sport, go to the yoga studio. Often, this is a triggering and controversial thing to say, there's often a reason why people don't want to exist in their body. When I was an overweight, chronically dissociated teenager who spent way too long on video games, the honest reality is that I did not want to exist in my body as it got worse and worse because my body didn't feel beautiful. And it was something that I could actually change. I'd never trained. I'd never tested myself. I hadn't developed strength and feelings of softness and feelings of flexibility and all of the bodily reality that I now experience. I wasn't expressive with my body. You see in my videos, I move around and I gesture and I literally stand up as I film so that I can use my body as a second language to communicate an idea with you. I use my face. I use my gestures. I didn't have any of that when I was a teenager. Of course, that's part of the process of aging. Teenage years are always very awkward. But if you're chronically underweight or chronically overweight, and it's something which we inherited from a societal story, and something which can shift in a moment of awareness of realizing just how beautiful the bodily reality can be if we shift towards something which is healthier and more actively engaged from the ground up perspective. You have a pretty good reason to be in the body. There's no convincing required when you feel healthy on the inside. If you're sober, and if you're in shape, and if you've got a loving relationship, and if you have access to nature, and if you have, well, let's just say you have a great diet of organic food and clean water and the right supplementation, and you spend enough time standing, sitting, lying, stretching, you do all of these things stacked together, I don't need to convince you to spend time in your body and not dissociate into a screen. You'll naturally want to hang out here. You'll naturally want to enjoy the experience of dancing and walking and being a fleshy human. And you'll also find a releasing of tension around things like the awkwardness of sweating or going to the toilet or having certain responses that just happen, inflammation responses, whatever it might be. Of course, everything doesn't just happen. There are reasons for things, but for the sake of simplicity, if you have a loving relationship to your body, as confirmed through a loving lifestyle which is neither too much nor too little, and you abandon those stories that we've been fed of being the little boy or the little girl who learns to ignore their bodily signals in school and either overeats or undereats and continues that for 20 or 30 or 40 years, doesn't know when to go to the toilet because you've been conditioned to hold it all in or go way too frequently. You're chronically dehydrated because you're only allowed to have, 500 milliliters of water a day. These crazy experiences at school, if we don't challenge them as adults and take healthy inspiration from genuinely healthy people out there, we're really missing out on opportunity. You don't need to do it all at once. I do recommend that you go into books like The Denial of Death by Ernest Becker, The Betrayal of the Body by Alexander Lowen, The Body Bears the Burden by Robert Scare, and The Body-Centered Psychotherapy by Ron Kurtz. You can also, again, look at Abraham Maslow with his variety of work. For the sake of this video, if you've made it this far, you cannot escape bodily reality, and it's not something that you should try and run away from. If you want to get a feeling of existential peace, a feeling of being here and enjoying the moments as they pass by, make sure to ground yourself and set up a home inside your own skeleton. Make sure to feel yourself from the inside out, both from the mind-based perspective of it's healthy and nice and the narratives inside of you are loving and positive. You're not swearing at yourself or hating on yourself. You've done all of the cognitive, existential, depth psychology things. And you also have a lifestyle which encourages consistent, safe, secure, and enjoyable bodily reality. It's such a worthwhile experience. If you feel like it's not something that's meant for you, I guarantee it's meant for you. Anxiety doesn't need to be permanent. Neither does depression, neither does a feeling of disgust towards any kind of bodily sensation. We can heal this. If you want to heal this, then give yourself the gift of that experience for the next decades ahead. Don't wait any longer. Don't dissociate into another video. Start stacking the things that I mentioned. And just continue. Just live in an aware state where it's identity at every level and not prioritizing one at the detriment of another. I think that the very smart person understands that it's not about IQ and it's not about success out there in the world, because if you spend, let's say, 40 years building a business and by the age of 60 you are terminally ill because of all the stress and you neglected your body throughout the whole process to make millions, you're just going to spend the millions finding the best doctors to then perform surgeries on you that could have been prevented 35 years ago with just giving up certain chronically disruptive patterns. Or maybe just experiencing the naturally energizing experience of a loving heart, a healthy gut, and your feet firmly planted on the earth, and realistically, spend some time in nature as well. I also recommend spending time in nature, and tell you what, that's actually the action point for the end of the video. I do have another video over here, but please just go for a walk today, barefoot ideally. If you're in the city, just sell your house and move into the forest because it's probably better for you. I'm joking, but there's the next video, and also go for a walk.